Welcome back. We've arrived at the end of our first day, and it's been quite a journey. We've had some ups, we've had some downs, but overall, I think it's been an incredibly rich day. It's been really exciting. There's been so much happening in all of the sessions. I'm really excited to have such a strong engagement from our community, and I cannot tell you how impressed I am with the global diversity that we've been able to gain today. It's just been overwhelming, and I want to thank you all for your contributions today, for your engagement, for the interaction, the way you took up the design thinking approach. It's really been inspiring. And so we're going to take that inspiration one step further. Before we do, I want to ask, where is everyone in their conference journey? So we have another poll. It's just to the right of your screen. I want to know, are you kind of joining? Is this one of your first sessions? Maybe you're kind of just waking up over in New York or in South America, and maybe this is one of the first sessions you're joining today. Or are you kind of overwhelmed with how much you've done already today and you're looking forward to kind of resting and reflecting tomorrow? Or perhaps you just feel like you're halfway through and you're excited for tomorrow as well. So I want to know where you are in your conference journey. While you're taking your poll, I want to also take a moment to just admire and speak of the feeling of privilege I have that we have our keynote speaker with us today. She is the Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. Professor Fionnuala D. Aoláin is the University Regents Professor at the University of Minnesota, and she also holds the Robina Chair of Law, Public Policy, and Society. And not only that, she's also the Faculty Director of the Human Rights Center at the University of Minnesota Law School. And as if that wasn't enough, she's also concurrently the Professor of Law at Queen's University Belfast School of Law. And she comes also from outside the academic world, a very strong human rights and international law background. Professor Aoláin also served as representative of the prosecutor at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and domestic war crimes trials in Bosnia. She, in 2003, was appointed by the Secretary General of the UN as special expert on promoting gender equality in times of conflict and peacemaking. In 2011, she was appointed jointly by UN Women and OHCHR to prepare a study on reparations of conflict-related sexual violence. And in 2015, she was appointed the International Criminal Court's Trust Fund for Victims to lead the expert review on reparations to victims in the court's first case. So it's a formidable bio and background, and it comes with a massive amount of experience and wisdom, which we are so privileged to hear from today. So with that, Professor Aoláin, I'd like to hand the floor over to you for your keynote address.
Great. Thank you all. I'm really pleased to be joining you. I wish it were in person, but it's a great honor to address you to think about together some of the challenges that we face globally. And I'm going to use this keynote address really to set out for you the work and the challenges I'm seeing, and maybe we can plot a way forward or think of ways forward together. So maybe to start with some general and really harsh contextualizations around the state of human rights across the globe. Human rights protections and the rule of law are under severe and undulating strain. That was true before the pandemic. It's all the more true now. It's estimated by Civicus, a leading NGO, that civic space is restricted or impaired in 111 countries. That number was collated before the pandemic. And so it's higher today. In 2019, 300 human rights defenders were murdered. They include a rising number of women human rights defenders who lost their lives defending equality, reproductive rights, the right of access to land, as well as sexual and reproductive rights. Torture, inhuman and degrading treatment remains widespread and institutionally tolerated in countries north, south, east, and west. Multilateralism is under extraordinary institutional challenge, and that's not only because of the glaring budgetary constraints faced by international institutions, but because of the decisions by states, key states, to withdraw from or undermine from within the collective institutional capacity on common challenges, not only, but significantly in the area of health and the environment. As Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism and Human Rights, I also want to stress the challenges that securitization, counterterrorism, and extremism, countering extremism regulation, pose in multiple legal and political systems to the protection of human rights, an issue I'm going to return throughout this keynote. So human rights are an uphill struggle, but it remains true that even in a time of pandemic, the demands for justice by ordinary men, women, girls, and boys remain visible, and they continue to break through even in these extraordinarily difficult times. So protecting human rights in a time of global pandemic is not a simple matter. As David Fidler so prophetically noted in 1997, quote, "The structure of the international system is, however, irrelevant to the microbial world." Slogans like "germs know no frontiers" and "germs carry no passports" have been used since the founding of the World Health Organization. In international relation terms, pathogenic microbes constitute non-state actors with transnational power, close quote. So the outbreak of this global pandemic has stretched state capacity across the globe. We see it everywhere. It's simultaneously revealed by the robustness and the fragility of public health, education, transport, economic, welfare, and security systems all at once. The pandemic is, in a classic sense, an emergency challenge for states. It's this sudden and unexpected event that threatens the working life of nations, the living life of large numbers of persons, and the multifaceted physical manifestations of this pandemic cripple the capacity of health systems to function. There's no shortage of exceptional responses to this pandemic. They've included the physical lockdown. We're all at home, many of us listening to this, of millions of people. Mandates to return millions from cities to rural communities, restrictions on freedom of expression that challenge government management of crisis, the fake news crisis we experience in so many places, mandatory labor production, data tracking on the movement of persons, extensive border controls, and a broad range of political and legal controls that are far-fetching, and they function both at the wholesale and at the retail level. So quantifying the scale and form of the pandemic's effects on security and the rule of law remains a work in progress. It's a hard thing to measure what's happening in all of these spaces. But I think it's critically important that we try to do that, but also that we think about new and imaginative conceptualizations of both security and the rule of law in a time of pandemic, and perhaps most importantly, post-pandemic. So my remarks have four goals today. One is to set out the scope and nature of the challenges. I think I've done that a little bit. The second is to quantify, as much as it's possible to do at this moment, the nature and form of the challenges to the rule of law that are posed by the pandemic. And particularly, I want to hone in on security and securitization and the uses of security and securitization to manage the pandemic and what the implications of that might be. And third is to point to some positive and emergent signs that speak to the resilience of rights, even in times of crisis. And we'll close by maybe acknowledging the complexities on the road ahead for us all and find ways to address those complexities without flinching. Because always in complexity, there is always opportunity. So let me turn to talk about COVID-19 and what I want to call exceptional rule of law. I've already set out that general, and I think what is a really hostile and difficult terrain for global protection of human rights. As for the pandemic, I want to distinguish a four-pronged typology of exceptional powers that, in my view, is coalescing globally. So the first of these, if you want, sort of markers of global exceptionism is the formal invocation of emergency or exceptional powers by states. Sometimes that's enabled by constitutional means, sometimes it's by executives, sometimes it's by legislation. Formal emergencies have been put in place in many countries around the world, and we know that because they're called things like emergency. maybe what's more difficult to quantify beyond this formal range of exceptional powers are that a number of states have regulated extensively, but they haven't declared a formal emergency or used the rhetoric of exceptionalism. But they are essentially engaging in the de facto or normalized practice of the exception. So it's really hard to track that, really hard to measure its human rights effects because it's much more insidious, much more difficult to assess. What we see, how do we see that? We see it in regular legislative powers being used to address the pandemic. Sometimes it's in health legislation, neatly tucked away, where it's hard to see how much power the state is accumulating over our daily lives. We're seeing a lot of it in the use of police and military powers, which focuses on public safety and public order, often in highly coercive ways. It can, in that place, we see, involve the repurposing or expansion of public order provision, doing things like stop and search powers, keeping people in their homes. And we're seeing it particularly manifest at borders and in immigration law restrictions. So that's the second layer, the kind of ordinary but exceptional use of power, the de facto exceptionalism that's creeping into our daily lives. The third layer is the expanded use of executive powers in a number of countries, where we're seeing power grabs often by authoritarian leaning or authoritarian leaders. In some ways, that's one of the distinguishing features of this pandemic, that it's given authoritarian or executive power capacity at an unprecedented way, in an unprecedented way, to individuals who have shown a propensity to misuse executive or authoritarian powers, even before the pandemic. So we see a consolidation of existing patterns of authoritarianism. And in that, what goes along with it is the limitation of parliamentary or other oversight mechanisms. And states are getting their business done in ways that essentially are closing down further civic space, limiting the engagement of participation, all under cover of COVID. The fourth layer of emergency or exceptional practice that we're seeing in the COVID-19 pandemic is what I see as an adaptation strategy. And this is the adaptation of security and counterterrorism measures, many of which have been in place before COVID-19, many deeply problematic pre-COVID-19, but they now find themselves repurposed or with new purpose to a health emergency. Many states, as my daily work shows us, Special Rapporteur, have a vast arsenal of emergency powers available to them to do a whole range of things, both in terms of criminal justice systems, the use of intelligence, the use of surveillance, and the use of the coercive power of the state. And so repurposing that power has been a significant feature of a number of states. And so when we have states doing this kind of repurposing, they don't have to invoke new powers or go to great lengths to get new powers, because they have an arsenal sitting there already, which is now being re-legitimized, repurposed, revalidated in the context of a health emergency. Now, one of the things I want to say that those of us who've worked in exceptional systems for a long time will know is that when states and political systems resort to the exceptional, it's really hard to undo that. These things tend to get hardwired in ways that are pernicious and hard to undo. So common across what we're seeing in multiple states at this time is the exceptional nature of legal and political responses to COVID-19. And that's not unexpected. It's not that we shouldn't have an exceptional response to a health pandemic, but it's the scale, the nature, and the human rights and rule of law limiting nature of those responses that should worry us the most. So there's the most prescient danger I see is that these exceptional fault lines will become hardwired in the aftermath of the pandemic. And the issues from a human rights perspective are multifaceted. Discriminatory effect, for example, is often the most obvious area to discern a lack of compliance to international human rights standards in the regulatory response to COVID-19. Here and in multiple countries, we see exceptional measures being pinpointed or directed at particularly vulnerable groups who are already marginalized or excluded in highly specific ways. Gender, women, persons of different sexual orientations, age, older people, the lack of autonomy being directed towards elderly people, all of course in a way that is health speak or security speak, but nonetheless limits older persons in ways that we couldn't have imagined before the pandemic. And socioeconomic status, which is a really important slice at this point. So we see a disparate effect on different communities and negative consequences when these regulatory ends are really about not so much about protecting health, but in fact about serving other ends of the state, including security, political limitation ends, or rights restricting ends. In numerous countries, it's become clear that the burden of COVID-19 is being felt by highly vulnerable populations whose vulnerability is pre-produced from the pre-existing conditions of poverty, structural discrimination, food insecurity, lack of access to healthcare, and lack of access to clean water. Nothing, I think, could be more obvious to state that when the response to the pandemic is to stay home and to wash your hands, and you neither have clean water nor a home, then the response to the pandemic exacerbates the privileges of some and the exclusions of others. So that marginality and exposure of certain groups is, I think, a really, really challenging and significant piece of what we're seeing. We've also I think the other big trend we're seeing is, aside from disparate impact, is the observation that these practices of exceptionalism, whether they're policing, administrative, or executive, these are the things that may persist. These are the things that are being comfortably exercised by states and will be very hard to push away. And so the complexity we face is not only how do we address misuse in the current moment, but also how do we prevent the fundamental shifting of regulatory frameworks after COVID. So one of the reasons, and this is where I turn to the daily work that the mandate does, that I have a particular concern here, is because over the last 2 decades since 9/11, we've seen the misuse of counterterrorism and security actors, particularly directed against key actors. And those actors are civil society, dissenters, human rights defenders, and humanitarians. The use of security and counterterrorism measures is virtually unchecked in many parts of the world against these groups. And COVID-19 may give more, if you want, speed and capacity to that trend. It's this global repurposing of counterterrorism that is going to be, I think, particularly challenging for us to dislodge. And it, as I said, it re-accelerates, re-entrenches these patterns that have been in place since the events of 9/11. It's perhaps not by accident that it's worth us thinking on the convergence between the experience of this pandemic and the 20th anniversary of 9/11, which is coming towards us, an event that also reshaped the kind of emergency or exceptional response of the globe. We've seen accelerations on the limitations of rights, and we have to, I think, address the danger that the most fundamental of rights, fair trial, free expression, freedom of association, freedom of movement, that all of these are under threat in the current moment. And the lines between exceptionalism and normal are being blurred in ways not least because people are afraid and they're watching, we're all watching from the inside out. And many are prepared to give away things to make them feel safer from a health perspective, which makes the defense of rights all the more difficult in this moment. So this is all to say that while a vaccine may be found that address the ills of the pandemic, and we all watch and wait for that, I think with bated breath on every clinical trial, the post-COVID world may not have an adequate vaccine against rule of law deficits, authoritarianism, and the dignity costs that will be inflicted on large swathes of the global population by the legal regulation of the pandemic itself. So let me go to the third, the final part of my remarks, which is reasons to be cheerful, which may seem like a hard thing in the painting of that challenging global picture. But there are, and they really are, some positive aspects. The first is the positive human rights outcomes from the COVID-19 pandemic, I think, may include now an emerging consensus that health is an actual right, and that the right to adequate housing and water are fundamental rights. That the debate, a sort of a zero-sum debate that we've seen over the last couple of decades, whether these things are rights or not, that has fundamentally shifted, and we've seen a change in what rights count and what rights are rights. And that would be an enormous step forward. So this recognition of certain fundamental socio and economic rights is one really important reason to be optimistic. The second might be the recognition that the right to information is a safeguard in so many ways, including but not limited to the spread of disease across the planet, is a really important one, and will stabilize and invigorate debates about freedom of expression in individuals and groups. The other thing we're seeing, and this conference is just such an amazing example of that, is the extraordinary global organizing, even in the context of global lockdown. I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, part of each year when I'm not in Belfast, Northern Ireland. And the protests around George Floyd's death, the ways in which people were able to demonstrate, were called to demonstrate, to speak against racial inequality and injustice, even as they were afraid for their health, seems to be an enormous awakening moment, one that's been repeated in many places across the globe, where innovative and just old forms of protest, the commitment to organizing, and the response to communities who experience racism and inequality is a defining feature of this time as much as the pandemic is. All the more so in places like Belarus and Kyrgyzstan. We're seeing significant protests dislodging entrenched authoritarian figures in unexpected ways. And at the forefront of those fights, of course, are women. So in these places, it's impossible to assess what was the trigger for transformation. You would never have bet that it would have been transformation in the middle of a pandemic. And yet we have triggered things that have been almost unimaginable in the most challenging of times. And we see momentum in particular places, in particular spaces, and in contexts that seemed immovable. I think it's also fair to say that we see a greater awareness of the use and misuse of the responses to COVID-19 from human rights actors, stakeholders, and advocates. And for that reason, I think the language of empathy, which has dominated this conference, is also really important, because it's given rise to an understanding that only when we see the harms that are done to others can we change those harms. So I will pause there, and thanks to Megan and to the Harnessing Potential Conference for inviting me to make these remarks.
Thank you so very much, Professor. I want to pick up right where you left at that point about empathy. What your address really meant to me, and one very important message that I took away, was exactly that you came to it from a perspective of empathy. Understanding that not only does the pandemic have a disparate impact on different people, but also the regulations being put in place also have that disparate impact. How do we understand? How do we get our perspective into and looking through the eyes of the marginalized who are experiencing the pandemic in a very different way than we might be ourselves? And also, I think while you did that, you also helped us understand what could even be a temptation from among those people to give up certain fundamental rights, freedoms, in order for a modicum of safety. And I think a lot of discussions today, those discussions I've been able to be a part of, and I know many others, have really strived to be more understanding of what is the perspective of the end user when it comes to safety? What do they understand safety to be? What do they understand it to mean? And I think our purpose here, and you've so beautifully articulated it, was to how to ensure that that understanding of safety really does include a commitment to fundamental rights and to fundamental freedoms as well, and that we don't compromise on those. So thank you very much for that address. I'm now going to invite to the stage Dr. Mwambari once more, and he is going to engage the professor in a conversation unpacking some of those ideas a bit further. So Dr. Mwambari, I welcome you.
Thank you. I guess for you, Professor Aoláin, it's good morning.
It's early morning.
It's early morning, yeah. Thank you for joining us. So mine is to reflect with you. I just wanted us to engage in a dialogue. At some point, I would ask a question to begin with, but then at some point when you respond, I might also reflect on what we are discussing. So thank you very much again for that wonderful speech. So my first, I guess, question or statement I can make and request that you reflect on is you've spoken a lot about this response that we've seen from states, from certain states and abusing rights, you know, whether it's also taking extremely complex measures against COVID crisis. And my question would be, what's your reflection on state actors who have found themselves in a very complex world, if you want, where they have to guarantee the rights of people to protect their health, to give them that security, but they sort of want to guarantee those rights by infringing on the other rights of, you know, their freedom of movement, their freedom of speech, especially with this phenomenon that we have of fake news. So is there something called a balance? You know, how do you reflect on that tough, you know, place, please?
So I don't want to. I think we have to acknowledge that states are feeling, and governments are in a really difficult and challenging moment. There's no precedent for this, perhaps outside the confines of the 1918 flu, when we were a much less globalized and interconnected world, and where the costs of the pandemic have had such a ripple effect. So I think the first thing to do is to recognize that this is complex governance. It's a complex governance challenge. The second recognition would be that states do have a right to limit rights, some rights. Some rights are absolute. The right to be free from torture is an absolute right, even in a time of pandemic. There's no justification. But there are other rights, as you've rightly said, David, that are limitable. The right to freedom of expression, the right to freedom of movement, for example. But I want to be clear about what we mean when we say we can limit those rights, is that if states are limiting the rights of freedom of movement for a health reason in a health pandemic, meaning it's a necessary and proportionate response to the actual crisis at hand, then states are justified in doing so, as long as also it's not in a discriminatory way. So if we only prevent some people from movement, a Muslim minority in a particular country, but not others, then clearly this isn't a wholesale restriction. It's a very retail restriction with discriminatory effect. But one of the challenges we're seeing is, of course, that not all of the measures taken have a health purpose. So the key here is when the state is limiting rights in the context of a health pandemic, then the limitation has to be limited to the actual crisis, that is the health crisis at hand. And it's very easy, of course, to second guess. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important at this time, even with all the challenges, that parliaments and courts stay open. We think of doctors as essential workers, but we should also think of lawyers as essential workers. And the reason is that states need help, and sometimes that helps come from civil society and from legal and political systems that say, your response is too much. It's not proportionate. It's not necessary. So it's recognizing the legitimate role of states to protect our security. And security is a human right too. It's found in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, but it's understanding the limits on the state's action in that space.
Very, very good. Yeah. So in a follow-up to that, we have also seen a response from, activists, and here I'm specifically speaking about those groups that have refused to abide to the to the collective response to COVID. For example, people want to protest and say it is my right, to move out of the house or not wear a mask. So people asking for their rights, but on an issue that is rather sensitive, but is also, if you guarantee their rights, they also will infringe on other people's rights, for governments that have chosen that kind of, those guidelines. So where is the responsibility of the citizens and also groups that do these kinds of organization?
Yeah, so I think it's I'm not going to pretend that there's a global answer to that question that satisfies specifically, because we take each context, each jurisdiction in its own space. So we but I think we do have some frameworks to help us think that through. The first is that we also have, international law also articulates the idea of duties. And so, for example, the African Human Rights Charter articulates very clearly not just a notion of rights, but also duties of individuals to their communities. And I think that's an important reminder that the balance is sometimes around our obligations to each other. And human rights, I think, framework and the rule of law also recognize that we have duties to one another. And it is really challenging when individuals choose not to recognize that notion of solidarity and collective responsibility in a collective challenge. But I think it's also equally important to hold on to the idea, which is almost like the idea of holding two contradictory ideas in your head at the same time, which I think is always the hallmark of an intellectual, that you can think about two things at once that may look like they don't connect. But it's the idea that in addition to this idea of duties, that there's also a legitimate need for people to express their point of view and to be able to do so in ways that include other forms of rights, including assembly or protest. And what we've seen, what's really interesting, is what we've seen in a number of countries, that people are protesting in ways that are consistent with health regulations. They're wearing masks, they're engaging in social distancing. We've had some extraordinary examples, for example, of single protests. So a very innovative way that we've seen in some countries is because there are limitations on groups gathering, we've had individuals standing with signs and then being replaced by another individual and another individual. So we have singular but group protest as a way to kind of express solidarity, but do so within the rules. All to say that it's this challenge both of acknowledging the need for social cohesion and solidarity, but recognizing that if we don't allow individuals the right to express their views and the right to do that in ways that include legitimate protest, then we often create gaping holes of a lack of accountability and a lack of acknowledgement of the failure of the state in really important ways.
Oh, that is a fantastic reflection. Very, very rich indeed. So when I was reading your bio and some of your work, it seems like you have a lot of experience on local, on international level. And so my question turns to what we could say is non-state actors, and not just speak about COVID crisis, but also after or before some of the complexity that we see on how projects are designed, and also how they are managed, and especially projects that have to do with the themes that we are interested in, of human rights and security and rule of law. And so I just want we talked a little bit about power different kinds of ways that different individuals, organizations use power in this collaboration efforts to counter this problem. So my question to you, I guess it's not even a question, it's just how do you reflect? You know, I think that's the best way to put it. After all this experience you've had, why is it that this imbalance between international actors and local actors when they are trying to solve, you know, the mind is to solve a local problem? Why is it that in international systems and in these kinds of collaboration, why does it remain an imbalance? And how do we really push in a practical way towards equity and sharing of power, or rather, you know, developing the vision of finding a solution, similar mindset, you know, is this achievable cross-culture, cross-class, cross-gender? I mean, what's your reflection on that, if I hope I make sense?
No, absolutely. And I firmly believe in the power of the local. I have spent most of my adult life working in one very specific place in Northern Ireland, a place that was defined by violence. Depending on when you start, it's either in the 1600s or in the early 1970s. Irish historians argue about the start of the conflict, as many post-colonial societies do. Yeah. When did it start? And my experience has always been that the most powerful and empowering work we do is in local communities, in our own spaces. That's where we should all be starting. I often encourage my students when they say they want to go out and do things in the world, and I ask them, well, what's happening at home? What can you do at home? What's happening in your community? Because that's where we have the most impact and where we are most connected. So I think the power of that, it's been a motif of my own work and my own life. But I will also say you are absolutely right. That the global systems, and I'm going to include the global kind of institutional systems like the United Nations, the European Union, the African Union, the Organization of American States, they are a long way away from the local. And one of the biggest gaps I see globally is the failure of those systems to really, first of all, make space for civil society and for the local to come into the global and speak to it adequately. And certainly in the area I work in of security and counterterrorism and conflict, the local is deliberately excluded because often they don't want to hear it. It might actually require you to change what you do if you bring in the local and you really listen to what they're saying. So part of the construction of systems is actually designed to exclude the local. And so that's one of our really major places of work, I think. If we're going to think about a post-COVID, it is about local organizing, and it is about being really invested in the places where we are, but it's also about making claims on the international to listen to the local, which means literally creating space for civil society, for stakeholders to come into those spaces. And the place where we most see that in the UN is in Geneva. We have a Human Rights Council, and there are many opportunities for civil society actors to emerge. But if you go to New York, for example, that's not true, because civil society is it has its corner in the human rights space, but not in the security spaces that dominate so much. So we have to make that demand. And sometimes, and when I say we, literally civil society has to show up. And that's hard because, first of all, we're now all restricted. But I think we also have to both literally and metaphysically knock on those doors and demand space and demand a seat at the table. And also demand that when we have a seat at the table, that we're listened to, because it's very easy. Sometimes it's easy to create the seat, but then tick a box that says, oh, we invited those people, now we're done. And the really hard piece is closing the loop, which is that it's about inviting in the local, but actually being meaningfully prepared to listen to what they say and change what you do based on what you hear.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Nyorin. This was really a pleasure engaging with you, and I want to conclude as I started. We gave a poll in the morning, with our audience. Were they seekers of justice or security? Were they beholders, or was it complicated? Looking at your background and mine, I think it's complicated. I think we have been both at the receiving end of insecurity and human rights abuses, and we are now on the other side of looking for solutions, working for solutions, expressing empathy in this process. So, I think it's also good to have people who have complex, relationship to these problems, also being part of the solution. Thank you very much again for taking the time to engage with us, and do have a good day.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor to join you all.
Excellent. And I want to thank you, David, as well, for leading us through this really rich discussion. It's been fantastic to hear you guys reflect again on the need for empathy, on the need for understanding the perspective from the local end user, from those experiencing the problem most directly. I think you guys embodied that very clearly, and it's a message that we're hearing loud and clear. So thank you, guys. With that, I'm going to start wrapping our first day to a close. I want to see if we can look at the poll results real quick. I know that they can be shown for our viewers online. But I was really excited to see that the vast majority of you are planning to join us tomorrow as well. We have another rich day of programming. We have about 8 sessions, and one includes, and I'm going to do a little plug myself, one includes a community consultation on the next iteration of the Knowledge Platform for Security and Rule of Law. We have an opportunity to adjust, to shape ourselves in a different way. So we really would love to have some of you come in there and help us design, get into design mode, help us think through what are some ways in which we can bring this together better to serve you, our community. There's also sessions on protecting justice data, justice for women, the nexus between environment and conflict and security and rule of law, new technologies in East Africa, and also local justice within the Gambia and how that's actually being influenced by international collaborations, international pathways. So there's a lot on there. Oh, and there's another one, sorry, I just forgot, on empathizing with SSR policymakers, which I'm really excited about because that's definitely a group of people whose head I want to get into. So once again, it's been a really long day, but in a very good way. We've had a really rich discussion across a huge number of topics. There's no way I'm going to be able to bring it to a whole summarizing close. So I'm just going to bid you adieu for the evening and look forward to seeing you tomorrow. The first sessions begin at 10 o'clock, I believe. Yeah, it's on the program. We'll see you then, and take care.